First of all, this concept of doctorateness in the Anglophone literature, it seems to come out of education research. And it's a contested topic, not just about the level of determining doctorateness as opposed to other kinds of postgraduateness, but also what might constitute the qualities of doctorateness. Is this to do with skills or is it to do with critical abilities? So there's not a consensus even within education, and then obviously more widely than that there's not a consensus. It seems to be mapped quite tidily in more scientific disciplines onto this issue of method. So obviously in the sciences we've got the notion of the doctorate as a kind of technical training. It's just a continuation of education where you learn more and more about the contemporary practice. And so it seems to be that dealing with doctorateness would very much be to do with competencies in scientific areas. And so I think it leads to an easy recipe for what should be in doctoral training programs. So I think doctorateness maps onto the training program as to whether that's an adequate professional training for practicing in a discipline. But in humanities, I think it has a slightly different situation. First of all, my take on methods in humanities is that we're much more interested in the underlying methodology than in the method. And what I mean by that is, the method is the series of actions that one undertakes. You interview somebody or something like that. But the methodology is the belief set in which this is a useful thing to do in relation to your problem. So there are a number of different methodologies that one might subscribe to or map onto a problem. And I'm thinking that these are broadly paradigms of thought, like the feminism, post-structuralism, post-colonialism. These are belief sets within which certain activities would be appropriate for pursuing a problem and other activities would not. And of course, within humanities, we've got less institutionalization about these methods. So although in sciences methods come along with names, I think in humanities we've got many unnamed methods and a certain freedom to create methods, to say this activity plus this one in a slightly interdisciplinary way would make sense within this critical framework, within this critical approach to the problem. And that leads to such a proliferation, I think, in humanities that there's a lack of clarity, therefore, about what should be in research methods training. But perhaps if we were to say anything, it would be that humanities, and in particularly creative arts people, need to be clear about the methodology that they're working within. They need to be clear about their critical position and what makes that coherent, rather than this is the off-the-shelf method. So this is talking about doctorateness from the point of view of using it as mapping it onto research training. So doctorateness belongs to research training. It determines what goes on in research training, and therefore what we should put into the courses. But that's not the only way in which doctorateness is discussed in the Anglophone area. So in my paper, what I've done is pick up on the fact that just last year there was a published kind of dispute, or at least one academic paper was actively critiqued by a second academic paper. And I wanted to take that as an indication that there is not complete unanimity about this notion of doctorateness, even within the educational area. And I wanted to look at, well, what causes these disputes? At what level do these people disagree? Are they disagreeing? Do they broadly agree the concept, but disagree the details? Or are they really coming at it from completely different points of view? And of course I concluded the latter, hence the comparison with, rather pale, isn't it? But I'm sure Wellington and Poole, who wrote the original articles, wouldn't mind being compared to Plato and Aristotle, who are in the middle, because here we've got, in the painting, we've got the embodiment of two completely different approaches to the nature of the external world. I love that it's all down to a gesture, that Plato is doing this, and Aristotle is doing this, and that just says it all. So they're looking in two completely different directions for the solution to their problem, and I think that's what we actually find tolerable in humanities and creative areas. I mean, Aristotle does not negate Plato, nor vice versa, but if this were a scientific dispute, I think we would have the idea that through some dialectic process, knowledge gets superseded, so, for one reason or another. Now, I think in our disciplines, we would describe that, we can talk about that perhaps in the discussion, but we don't have the same model for the relationship of one pocket of knowledge to another. And therefore, doctorateness requires different skills, I think. But in these two articles, what I identified was that one of the authors, Wellington, uses case studies. So his approach is to look at what people actually do, and the diversity of activity in the case studies led him to conclude it was difficult to identify fundamental criteria that could be applied to all of these cases. So for him, the plurality represented a certain amount of difficulty, although perhaps it helped him to come to a conclusion that I rather think he wanted, which was that there were not fundamental criteria. Poole, on the other hand, instead of looking at individual case studies and trying to generalise from those cases, approached it from the opposite way. And he undertook a kind of structural analysis. So he went back to basic principles of what he thought constituted a doctorate and then mapped that onto individual cases. So as a result, he started from the position that there were certain core criteria, there were certain structural features to a doctorate, no matter how that is then manifested in individual cases. So stepping back from those two, what can I say about those two? And using the metaphor of the painting, I guess I'm noticing that the figures in the painting are all contained within a single piece of architecture, albeit fantastic. And that piece of architecture for me is the social construct within which we have doctorates at all. So for me, doctorates occur within a subject area, within a community, who act socially and bring values to bear and make decisions about activities within that specialist area. And in particular in the doctorate, whether the questions that are being addressed are topical and relevant, whether the methodology that's being adopted is topical, whether the methods are appropriate, and whether the conclusions are useful in some way. And those are discipline-specific decisions. And more broadly, within the university, we authorise certain people to make those decisions. So we have a class of persons who are professors and external examiners and so on. This too is a social activity of delegating responsibility to a subgroup of people, authorising them to make decisions on behalf of the larger community, and giving them consequently the responsibility for it. And then we have an even larger group, more general still, of society in which we have universities, in which certain types of training for activities that occur in society at large, like architecture and medicine. We train doctors and architects, and we do so in the university, not in some other place. So socially we have created a belief set in which there is such a thing as higher education outside of a professional context, and that is useful. So I see all of this operating socially, that we have communities or tribes of people differentiating themselves, and at a certain level larger groups authorise these smaller groups to do certain things like train architects or train doctors. So breaking this down, in my title I said, where do we look for evidence of doctorateness? And I think we've got four, I held up three fingers there, four areas that we should look. I think we have intrinsic sources that are presented at the moment of determining doctorateness. So the moment of determining doctorateness is the final examination, and the intrinsic evidence that's presented is going to be a thesis, and perhaps there's also artworks and practical work as well. Depending on the country, you might also be presented with the candidate. That isn't a universal feature of doctoral examination. Then I think we have extrinsic sources, sources that are not present in the room on the day. That is represented by the examiner's knowledge of the current state of the field, of the knowledge and practices that are going on in the wider world outside that room. And therefore the topicality and the relevance of the questions that are being asked, I think that's important. If we just have a little thought experiment, a slightly extreme case, but if somebody came along to an architectural doctoral examination and they presented material of a kind that you might expect in a science presentation, then it might not pass. No matter how good a bit of science it is, it's no good as architecture, it's irrelevant. Or if somebody came along and gave a dance performance. So there are a whole load of practices that we think are going to be acceptable at this moment and not acceptable before we get down to the detail of the quality of what's been done. You know, we don't expect somebody to start making a painting or singing a song or something like that. In some cases we will. In certain disciplines that's exactly what we want them to do. And in other disciplines we'd be shocked. I think that's relevant. So I've said intrinsic sources, things that are present in the room to determine doctorateness, but there are also a lot of extrinsic things outside of that room that are determining our judgment. Then I think there are discipline-specific sources. That I think is about, I'm not sure exactly what fits into all of these categories yet, we'll come on to that, that's a kind of speculative part of what I've written at the moment. But I'm thinking that certain techniques would be relevant. I've just had the experience of somebody who wanted to come and do a PhD at my university as a fine artist, and they came along with a portfolio that made me think, because they were from Romania originally, and their BA training was in all sorts of craft skills, like gilding, and basically they'd been trained as a kind of icon painter. So the output from this and the BA work was all religious art that you might find in a church, in a Catholic church. And it made me realise that there are all these first of all these skills that you might need nowadays as a conservator of paintings, of religious artworks. But also there's a market for this religious icon painting. Obviously there are a lot of religious institutions. And this was a separate kind of art world than one that I'm normally confronted with. But it presented me with a problem, because this person would need to transform their work, because the concept of the PhD that we were running and that we could manage within my school would expect them to be practicing as a Western contemporary artist. So in other words, they had methods, and indeed this person perhaps occupied a methodological, critical mindset that didn't fit. So no matter how good their work was in that area, it was not going to pass a PhD, because we were not going to be able to understand it or find examiners, however meritorious it is in its own field. So there are discipline-specific limitations, what's acceptable and what's not, what's current and what's not. And then I think there are generic sources, and I've mentioned some of them already. We've got the idea of the university as a community, the idea of what it is to be a researcher. In Britain we have an organisation called VITAI, which is a kind of national coordinating body interested in training researchers in any field. I'm on a working party for the UK CGE, the UK Council for Graduate Education, about maintaining the quality of the UK doctorate across all fields. So there is a concept that there's something common here that isn't discipline specific. And I think I would still seek skills and competencies at this general level, such as doing the equivalent of doing a literature review as being part of a doctoral programme, because you need to know the current state of knowledge in order to make a gap analysis, to identify an opportunity to add something to what we already know, or our current interpretations or understandings. And indeed, one of the criteria that Wellington came up with in his article that was my origin was this idea of the outcomes being publishable. In some way this represents that what you are producing as an outcome is original enough and worthwhile enough and relevant enough that other people in your field would want to find out about it, and that it would pass the peer review process for journal publication, or the equivalent. Take all of these terms as being inclusive for whatever medium is being discussed here. So, sticking my neck out, I made this, which is one of these little logic squares, a Boolean square, in which I mapped extrinsic and intrinsic sources against generics, a generic meaning a general subject or subject-specific sources, and I tentatively identified these four things. So at work we have got a social context, an academic context, we've got notions of competencies and skills, and we've got the notion of an outcome contribution. And what I want to say about these is that these all need to be judged as activities led by communities. So I'm not thinking that if we examine these things ontologically, we will find some fundamental structures and criteria. I used to approach it like that, but more recently I'm moving away from that approach, because I think these things are not at all fixed. In the academic context, for example, we're constantly adding, maybe sometimes we even subtract, subjects that are in the universities. And so I invite us to think that there are groups of people, there are communities, and there are perhaps even representatives of those communities whom socially we empower with decision-making about these activities. So we need to look at how communities, what the community objectives are. And I think the question of doctorateness is not contained in any one of these boxes, but is the whole square. So the reason that we can find disagreements between Wellington and Poole, in my case, is because one of them is operating one of these boxes, one of these quadrants, and another one is operating in another. And in fact, doctorateness, the quality control mechanism for doctorateness is that no one group has got the autonomy to run away and say, we will invent doctorateness for ourselves. So the disciplines, in particular the disciplines, don't operate in isolation, that the disciplines are contained within a university, and there's even a wider social context. And just to close, my anecdote in the paper, I think, is that certainly in Britain, occasionally one gets an outburst in the newspapers, an outrage that some gallery is showing a shocking piece of contemporary art. And I think this is a symptom when the expert group whom socially we entitled to tell us what is art, so gallery curators, under the institutional theory of art, gallery curators define what constitutes modern art. But just sometimes they take a step too far, and the broader social context comes back and says, no, you've lost the plot here. We don't accept that this is art anymore. And so there's a balancing mechanism that no one group is working on its own. But basically, I'd like to put on the table an institutional theory of artistic research, which is to say that the universities and the subject disciplines are the ones who determine what constitutes research and what constitutes good research, but they don't do it on their own.
Thank you very much. Now we invite the internal experts to ask questions as agreed. Maybe I'll go.
Should we? Any thoughts?
Björn Routledge, I have to say my name every time I say something. I was just interesting, I just saw an opportunity to compare what you're doing to what we are doing musically in the university. And that was the thing about the Romanian icon painters, as you said, had great skills, but still belong to another art world. Which is kind of a similarity that we actually experienced when we started with the popular music, musicology at the university, that actually the respect for what we did, or the skills maybe, even from the teachers, wasn't there. So in your kind of problem, was it the skills that stopped, or the disrespect of what they did, that made it impossible to make them pass the PhD?
Well, I think your situation is not unique. Over the last sort of 30 years or so, many creative areas have been newcomers into the university context. And so I think that they have all suffered a certain resistance to the entry. And in my university, for example, you get the art school joins and nobody really knows what to do with it. They think everybody's interesting and colourful and sexy, but they've no idea what it is that they're doing. They don't speak the same language. So I think it takes some time for these things to settle down, and it requires both an adaptation on the part of the university, first of all, to go into an accepting frame of mind and to think that there might be something here, but also for the discipline to adapt and find its own language. And I think we can see that happening in creative arts, in architecture, and all of these things. There's a top-down and a bottom-up movement. What else did I want to say about that? No, would that do for the moment?
Can we follow up on Daniel, University of Gothenburg? It seems to me that if we follow up on what Björn just said with music, practicality and composition, it seems that the generic part of that picture is easier to fulfill than the specific. When it comes to getting, I know that at the University of Gothenburg there's been a debate or a process of getting artistic research, how do you say it, assessed at the same level as scientific research, and they have managed to put up or to get external acceptance on the assessments of artistic research. So, and I'm under the impression that boils down to the specific parts of that, the academic context and the contribution from a more scientific.
I think so, although I do think when this process is completed and this acceptance, when things are accepted, it's much more profound. I see that in some schools and some environments, they have made a better job of persuading their university or persuading society that artistic research is a valuable activity. But if we compare this to what happened back in the 70s with the qualitative research movement, by the time that process had been completed, it wasn't only qualitative research that had been accepted, it had altered our view of quantitative research. And so even people working in areas that were apparently unchanged would now describe what they do using different vocabulary. And that's an indication that the job has been completed, I think. And so I see, if we make that comparison, we've got quantitative research that was around for a long time, then we have qualitative research appearing in the kind of 70s and 80s. Now we've got these creative areas coming in. If they are indeed a slightly separate group of people bringing in different methodologies, when this process of incorporation has been completed, it will alter the vocabulary of the qualitative and the quantitative people. They will describe what they do in different terms. And one thing that gives me confidence about that is whenever you talk about research in creative areas in university meetings, all the other subjects say, well, of course we're creative, you know, engineering is creative, mathematics is creative, everybody wants and values creativity, everyone has these notions of originality. So many of the things that apparently identify the creative areas as creative areas are in fact shared qualities, but nobody has had to really talk about those things in the past. The definition of their previous research activities didn't require it. Now it requires it. So if everybody adopts the discourse of creative arts in describing what they do, even if they are mathematicians, then I think we will all understand one another better, and this process of incorporation will have happened.
Thank you. Then we go to Telemark.
Laila?
Marta eller Laila?
Thank you, Laila. I would like to ask a question about the examiner's role, because in your paper, when you write about Wellington and Poole, then you describe them as a gatekeeper or a community builder, and I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit about that.
Yes, well, Poole raised that. In his paper, he noted that Wellington, whom he was criticising, was making all sorts of assumptions about various roles and activities. For example, when work is presented for examination, is it the work on its own, or are we also examining the candidate? And one of the things he also identified was, is it the examiner's role to act as a gatekeeper, in other words, to exclude people who are not suitable, or are they a community builder, so are they mainly concerned to invite in new things that will develop and enhance the area? And he doesn't have an answer to that, but he points out that in the literature about doctorateness, this is one of many actual contradictions where we need to realise what's the role of examiners in the examination process and how we're using it before we can determine whether it's working effectively or not. So I think that's perhaps something for this group. I mean, what's the role of the doctorate? I was thinking of even starting my presentation with pointing out that something like evaluation can only take place if we're clear about what the objectives are. But since I wanted to problematise that, I didn't actually say that.
Do you have a specific position in relation to this?
To objectives? I think one of the ways that we can help to resolve the questions that seem to go round and round is to be clearer about this category that we are creating, but we barely have at the moment, of the artistic researcher or the architect researcher. What does this person do? What is their job? What is their role in society? What is their role in our community, either the community of the university or the community of the profession of architecture or fine art or whatever it is? And because they're a new category, and at the moment they bridge existing categories, I think we don't really know what to do with it. But if we have an image of what they will need to do, then we will know how to train them.
As we follow up on this line of thought, I find the square is very interesting for reflection. So, and I don't understand that you would not say that they are fixed, and it's not a search for truth about it, it's a search for developing criteria for assessing which part of the different sources and different qualities are possible to include.
Yes, indeed, yeah. These squares are a way of helping to organise one's thoughts. They're not fixed. They don't have the hard boundaries that they have in the little diagram. But this is an invitation to think, well, are we either assuming things or perhaps getting into a muddle between what is intrinsic and what is extrinsic, between what is generic and what is specific, and how they fit together. Because the thing that we're considering, Doctorateness, I think includes this whole box. But in here we've got a number of things, and I think the disagreement between Poole and Wellington, for example, can be identified as a conflict between two of these quadrants. I'm not exactly sure what to put in, and each day I'll probably change my mind about what I want to put in each box, because it's a way of kind of self-criticism, critical analysis.
It's very good for reflecting as well, but would you say that it's possible to use that kind of organizational thought to say that one doctorate is better than another one?
Well, I think in terms of fitness for purpose, but whether the fitness for purpose is to satisfy an academic objective, to satisfy a series of competencies, to have some social role, I think that we're unclear. And one reason why we're unclear is because this imagined category of the artist researcher doesn't exist yet. So we're not quite sure where does this person live? Do they live in academia, or do they live in the professional world? I had a conversation with a curator one time who said that she would only be interested in the outcome of artistic research when it produced good art. And I think that's a questionable assumption, because good artistic research might not be the same as good art, because for one thing, the decision makers are different. Curators on the one hand, or academics on the other. They may have the same value set, but they don't necessarily have the same value set. No?
Challenge.
Mel, I wanted to ask about your statement on research training. You mentioned the nature of research training changes from training in specific technical competences into training in a particular intellectual stance. Whether you have some ideas on how you would approach training a particular intellectual stance?
From my experience, that's what goes on in humanities and arts schools. So I'm going back to, that one, where rather than thinking that we have a set of techniques that everybody needs to learn, what we're training is a kind of critical attitude. And I think that goes on in creative areas right from undergraduate studies, that it's about being explicit and understanding one's framework of judgment as well as exercising that judgment. Now, I think in some other subjects, and particularly in sciences, there is a consensus about the framework that is to be used, and so that's not really a concern of the student. Being a professional, a competent contemporary professional, involves adopting that dominant paradigm and working within it because of this underlying set of values, that knowledge is to be increased and incremented through a process of criticism and addition. That's not the model of knowledge in humanities, so that's not a relevant framework to work in. So it's more appropriate that students should understand their position in relation to a question and be able to be explicit about that, and therefore we understand the relevance of what they're doing. The doctoral training programs that I'm aware of really focus on that kind of thing. A lot of explanation about why you're doing it this way rather than what you're doing.
Do you think that's really already systematized in the book? Because I have the impression...
I don't think it's explicit.
Yeah,
that's what I would like to say about that. I think people are doing it, but I don't think they necessarily know why.
Yeah, because I see that sometimes in seminars or that people get questions about the methods or technological competence,
confusion then maybe with what you said.
Absolutely, I think there's a great confusion with this situation. I think in some disciplines there are named methods, and it's very clear when you use them, and you would analyse a problem perhaps in order to facilitate using a particular method, or in certain circumstances this method would be the appropriate one to use and this one wouldn't. And so a student might fail because they've used an inappropriate method in relation to the question and the objective. I think that's very rarely the case in interpretative disciplines. I mean, one might choose a rather outdated methodology, and I think it often comes up in the choice of examiners. One has to be careful to choose examiners who either have the same methodological approach or at least are sympathetic and don't represent some opposite school of thought, or they will have difficulty in understanding the value of the work. So that again I think is a symptom that there are a great many intellectual frameworks that one could map onto the same problem in humanities, and in other disciplines I think that would not be regarded as relevant. It would be regarded as old-fashioned and outdated and not professionally competent to adopt a non-current technique in relation to a problem, except from a point of view of historical curiosity.
So in doctoral education we should be more explicit about that distinction?
I think we need to be explicit, yes. This is part of the intellectual property and ownership of the candidate, that they understand what makes their approach relevant. So they could do a number of different things. I mean, for one thing, it's about the relevance of making a painting or doing a dance or whatever it is that you're doing. What makes that an appropriate action to have taken, and it's appropriate as a method within a broader methodological framework. And unless the candidate can be accountable for that, we can't understand why they did what they did and not something else.
Well, we are just in time to close your presentation and the questions. And thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much.